What if you could go back in time and watch the legendary Billie Holiday perform? Mosaic Theater is bringing that immersive nightclub experience to D.C. Its new play about the iconic singer has a live band and cocktails to transport you to 1950s Philly. Lady Day runs at Mosaic Theater September 5th through October 6th at the Atlas Performing Arts Center. Get tickets at mosaictheater.org.
Today on CityCast DC, so more people have died in car crashes this year than in all of 2014, which just happens to have been the year when the DC government promised to cut these deaths to zero by 2024. So what went wrong? The Washington Post's Rachel Weiner is the author of a big report about the policy known as Vision Zero, and she's here to tell us. Today is Thursday, September 5th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Rachel. Thank you for being here.
Of course.
So you reported in the Post that a decade after launching Vision Zero, DC's number of traffic fatalities has doubled. So in my book, that's like a failure. Can you explain what the idea was in the first place?
Sure. So Vision Zero is something that started in Sweden in the 90s, kind of spread across Europe and then the US. And it was this idea that any number of traffic deaths is unacceptable and that we can and should use engineering, enforcement, education, although that last one, I think there's a lot of disagreement over whether it has any impact. But basically, we should do everything we can to bring traffic deaths down to zero.
And just so people understand it, traffic deaths means if two cars hit each other and somebody dies, that's a traffic death, as well as if someone hits a pedestrian?
Yes, anything basically involved on the roads. If a motorcyclist hits a bicyclist, that would be a traffic fatality. The vast majority are cars, but not all cars hitting pedestrians. Actually, the most injuries and generally the most deaths are to people in cars, whether they're in the car that crashes on its own or whether they're in a car that's hit by another car. This year, about half the fatalities have been pedestrians and about half have been either the driver or passenger in a car. And then there's also motorcyclists, bicyclists. There's been one scooter rider death. So all of that counts as traffic fatalities. But the biggest group alone is pedestrian fatalities, which makes some sense because pedestrians are most vulnerable. So that's where I think a lot of the activism has focused, but it covers all modes.
So DC adopted this goal a decade ago. What have they done?
They've done some things. I think, a report from the DC Auditor's Office a couple of years ago said that it took them years to really launch. They didn't have a Vision Zero office until a few years ago. It was sort of just out there as a goal, but it was not something they were really focused on. In the past few years, they have, but I think what a lot of critics say is that they have done some kind of superficial or ancillary improvements. There are a lot of speed bumps on a lot of roads. They've extended some curbs. They've added lights. All of that is good, but what they're resistant to doing is what experts say would really bring down deaths, which is forcing cars to slow down, not just telling them the speed limit is 20 or 25 miles per hour and not even just giving them a ticket for going faster than that, but through narrower lanes, through more bike lanes, through more priority bus lanes, forcing cars to slow down. And that's obviously very controversial because people both from within the city and outside the city who are commuting on those roads do not want to have a longer commute.
Did not DC bring down the default speed limit from 25 to 20?
Yes, they did. And I think it's helpful, has shown to be effective, but, what traffic engineers will say is, if you put a sign on a road that has 6 lanes and say the speed limit is 20 miles an hour or 25 miles per hour, if someone's able to go faster, a good chunk of people will. And especially here, where we are in this, sort of unique situation where most drivers in the city are not within the jurisdiction of the city. And so you can ticket them, but your ability to enforce those tickets is limited. They are now being a little more creative in enforcing those tickets, which they hadn't been in the past. Like DC Parking Authority is now going out in Adams Morgan on the weekend and looking for cars from Virginia and Maryland with a ton of tickets. So that's interesting, and it's new, and we might be able to see some better enforcement there. But I think generally what makes the biggest difference is not enforcement, but re-engineering the road so people physically cannot go that fast.
And that is the thing that the traffic experts you talked to said DC had really failed to do.
Right. And to be honest, like most places have failed to do. And you look at the European cities that have really succeeded with this, they've basically blocked off parts of their downtown to be only for pedestrians. They've really made it more difficult to drive in a city center and more pleasant and easy to walk around a city center. And I think a lot of people in the US say, that's just not how our cities are designed. That's not how our culture works. You can't just keep cars out of downtown. And, I think the Bowser administration is very concerned about businesses downtown, which has been very slow to come back from the pandemic. And so their perspective is, we can't make it harder to park downtown. We can't make it harder to drive downtown. It's already struggling as it is. The counter argument is, if you made it a more pleasant place to walk, more people would spend time there. But it's sort of impasse because, without doing one or the other, there's no way to know how that would turn out. So instead, we have this sort of compromise that doesn't satisfy anybody.
In the 70s, DC closed off a number of downtown streets, and they quickly became, I remember this from, right before they reopened them, they became really sketchy, dangerous feeling places. A lot of people were sleeping there. There was, drinking. There was, it added to a feeling of unsafety. So it's, unfortunately, we ain't Copenhagen. We have a different sociology, different laws, different transport options. So I would imagine that in these conversations, there were some decent arguments for why not to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's not one I have really heard, and I was not here or anywhere in the 70s, so I can't speak to it. But I think the counterpoint would be DC has done these open streets experiments, including along Georgia Avenue, which is right where I live, and they've been very successful. A ton of people come out, they're walking, they're biking, they're playing pickleball in front of the strip club. It's incredibly wholesome. And so I think, it's possible to do this in a way that does not, create unsafety. Of course, that was temporary. Adams Morgan does it. I think Brookline has done it, H Street. Whether that can be maintained over time, I think is sort of an enforcement issue, a housing issue, a mental health services issue that's kind of pervasive across the city, but not unique to closing off streets, basically.
What does the city respond to these critiques?
They say that no other city in the U.S. has achieved Vision Zero, so that we're, not any different, which I think is true, although there are other places where deaths were going down before the pandemic and then started going up with the pandemic, where, traffic fatalities really went up everywhere in the U.S. DC was never going down. So other cities have gotten at least a place of some success where DC really hasn't, and we've gone, basically in the opposite direction.
The way you could look at it is whether or not they did the right thing with these large arterial streets that did not shrink. DC did a bunch of things that made a bunch of people think driving was more annoying. You get a lot more tickets from enforcement cameras. The speed limits have gotten slower. There's bumps, as you say. And the result of that was none of the safety improvements that were promised. There's a kind of right-wing critique, which is that all of this talk of safety is fake, and the real thing is like an ideological, environmental goal of having fewer people drive, but that for political reasons, people don't want to acknowledge that as the goal. What do you think of that critique?
Well, first of all, I would say the smaller safety improvements do make a difference, just not one that's going to be... Yeah, I think there are lots of interactions between pedestrians and cars that don't end up as a fatality or a major injury, but are still stressful. And when people see cars slower on their neighborhood streets, I do think they see that as a positive effect. And people have complimented DDOT's, that's the DC Department of Transportation's responsiveness, which in the past few years, which is new, to basically the way those things happen is someone requests it, and then the DDOT people come out and they do a survey and they figure out whether it makes sense. And then, some months down the line, they put it in. So it's not, there is a process to it. It's not like they're just throwing these things willy-nilly. It's because people have asked for it.
So look, there's also some circumstantial stuff, right? That has changed everywhere since 2014, including cars. More bigger cars have become more popular. I've read that Ford only sells one car anymore in America. Everything else is trucks and SUVs, which are heavier and therefore take longer to stop and therefore more deadly to accidents, to pedestrians particularly. Is that part of the calculation here as to why fatalities have gone up?
It's not something they've analyzed, and the crash reports on the DC crash website do not tell you the size of the car, which is too bad. I asked the DC DMV, and they said within the city, car size is actually trending down, but most of the drivers in DC don't live in DC. I wasn't able to get that data from Maryland and Virginia. They don't track it in the same way. So it's entirely possible that is a factor. There's only one crash I can think of this year, one fatal crash, where they specifically mentioned size as a potential part, but otherwise, they haven't analyzed it that way.
Another thing that's changed is that post-pandemic, more people working from home, the commute has changed, and that there's not this sort of one rush hour in and one rush hour out. It's a more constant thing. I think a lot of people who only go to the office once a week or twice a week might be more willing to drive because they can afford to park once a week, but not every day. Is that part of this rise in fatalities?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, I can't say causally that's the reason for the rise in fatalities, but definitely driving has gotten more dangerous. Driving has gotten more difficult, more miserable. It's a lot less predictable than it used to be because of the way, right, people's patterns have changed. And also because, during COVID, there was a period where there were very few cars on the street. There was very little traffic enforcement. And I think a lot of people got used to that. And now that traffic is back, but also all day instead of just, during rush hour and in directions that did not used to have a ton of traffic before because people might be working from home, but going out to lunch by car. It's really sort of those two things have come together to create just a lot of frustration and then a lot of dangerous behavior because of it.
Mayor Muriel Bowser's Art All Night is right around the corner, and the nonprofit District Bridges is taking part with 5 neighborhood events, each with its own theme, like The Art of Drag in Logan Circle, or Black Broadway and Beyond on U Street. Our whole CityCast DC team will have a booth at the Mount Pleasant location, alongside local artists, musicians, and business specials. So come hang out with us. It's all happening Friday, September 27th and Saturday, September 28th. Check out districtbridges.org/events for all the details.
So you mentioned one thing that experts say is contributing to the rise in fatalities, despite the promise of zero, is lack of enforcement. But that doesn't, at least personally, comport with my experience, because I seem to get tickets at some regular clip from the proliferating number of cameras. And the city's budget calls for a pretty radical increase in the number of enforcement cameras. They're also creating a traffic safety unit. Explain to me where the enforcement fall down has been.
I mean, first of all, look, the city will say, and research suggests that traffic cameras are effective and that people do slow down around the cameras. Most people only get one ticket, which suggests that they've, now understand that they can't speed at that intersection. I think a lot of the resentment around the cameras does come from the fact that they were initially set up by MPD and without any sort of analysis of whether they were in a place that was good for safety or important for safety, right? And not all of those cameras have been moved. And even now that they're placed by the Department of Transportation and supposedly in the places that make the most sense for safety, there's a new camera just this summer, right on the expressway by the Kennedy Center, where, you're coming out of the city, the speed limit drops. I think a lot of people see that as a speed trap, basically, right? And the same is true on 295. Now, it only gives you a ticket if you're going 10 miles or more over the speed limit. The city would argue it's good when you're coming off the highway to know that you're now in a slower zone. But I think, I can understand the other perspective that there are no pedestrians on those roads, and the only purpose of those cameras are, to make money. I think a common criticism of the cameras also is that people figure out where they are, but then they just speed back up immediately after the cameras.
And also in your reporting, you found that of the 34 people killed in crashes so far this year, at least 9 died within 250 feet of a traffic camera.
Right. So that goes to the fact that, people speed up after complying, or there are, over 1,000 people, like a subset, but a significant one, who have just tons of these tickets. Most of them don't live in DC. And again, because we can't enforce our camera tickets across state lines, there's basically there has been in the past, no way to enforce those tickets. So it doesn't really count as enforcement if people are just getting the tickets and never paying them. And so that's why this year they're trying the more targeted towing, which is interesting. Charles Allen, the head of the Transportation Committee on the DC Council, put forward this legislation where the DC Attorney General's office could sue people in Maryland and Virginia for their unpaid photo tickets. And so that's potentially a way both to get that revenue, because the city could use it, but also just, target those people in a way that would make them feel some pain and not speed in the city. Whereas right now, if you're not planning to park in the city, there really is no consequence for you as an out-of-state driver to ignoring those tickets.
Let me ask about behavior with cameras versus the good old-fashioned getting pulled over by somebody who wags a finger at you and gives you a ticket, because DC has now set up this traffic safety unit, which I presume is going to be doing some more of that. Is there, I'm sure someone has researched this, the question of whether the in-person ticket is more likely to lead to behavioral changes than camera tickets?
I think it's less the fact that you're being pulled over by a police officer and just the mechanics of how that can be enforced. If you're pulled over by a police officer and given a ticket and you don't pay it, you can be pulled over in your home state if you're from Maryland, and then your car could be taken away from you, or you could lose your driving privileges. And that can't happen with a camera ticket because they target the car, not the driver. They just take a picture of your back license plate. And so then the tickets are associated with the car, but they can't stop you personally from driving no matter how many of these tickets you have. So that is sort of just one makes it possible to take the person off the road, and with the other, it's harder. Now they can take the car away from you, but they can't take you off the road. So that's really the main difference.
What did you find in your reporting are the most dangerous roads or intersections? Are there things that we ought to avoid or at least slow down?
I mean, on this, I'll say the city deserves some credit. They've done a lot of data analysis, and they have some great maps on the Vision Zero website that you can look at that'll show you. And they've identified what they call the high injury network. And it's basically the biggest streets in the city, what they call arterial roads,
Like which ones?
It's Connecticut Avenue, it's Minnesota Avenue, it's New York Avenue, North Capitol Street, 7th Street, 14th Street, Northwest, K Street. Basically, think of the roads that you take to go in and out of the city. And those are generally the ones where the most serious injuries and fatalities happen.
You've put together this stuff that's sort of a bit of an embarrassment for folks behind this policy. What's next for it? What are they planning to do now?
Well, it's 2024. I think no matter what, we're going to try to come out with a new 2025 refresh. Basically, well, we didn't meet our target, but here's our goals for maybe the next decade. I think personally, it would make sense to give up on the Vision Zero model. Every year, the city has to report to the Federal Highway Administration how it's planning to reduce traffic fatalities and traffic injuries. And they give more realistic numbers. They'll talk about getting deaths down, 20%. And I think it probably makes more sense to just acknowledge that that's what they're doing and that's what's realistic, and not set themselves up for failure or set the expectation that they're going to dramatically change the way our roads work, because that is what would be necessary to really achieve Vision Zero. And if they're not willing to do that, it's kind of silly to pretend that they are.
Although the pretending, zero, it's such an laudatory goal that it actually probably helps push through some things that are going to be difficult for a lot of people. Like, change, like a lot of people don't want to slow down. But if you say it's in service of Vision Zero, it's maybe a little more impressive than if it's in service of like Vision 26.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. On the other hand, I think it breeds some cynicism where people say, well, like you said, deaths aren't going down. So why do I keep getting these tickets? Why are there so many speed bumps if it's not working, And maybe if they set more realistic goals, they could focus on those and then say it is working. Or they could say, hey, to achieve Vision Zero, we need far more people to commute by transit. So that's what we're going to focus on. We need cars to not be able to go down these streets at this speed. So that's what we're going to focus on. But right now, they're sort of claiming Vision Zero as a philosophy without really doing what would be necessary to achieve that.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here. Really great reporting.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
And that is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening. It really, really, really helps people find us. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.